She was 22 and had been cast out with a ruin. She had no family, no true prospects, and a deed to an estate so neglected it was considered a punchline in the county. With that, and a pittance of an annuity, Jane Pike was given Greystoke Manor near Holverton in Cheshire. But what the Duke who dismissed her did not know was that sealed within its crumbling library walls was a legacy of hope left by another woman, a secret that would allow Jane to build a life from the stones of abandonment. Settle in with us, and let us know in the comments where you are watching this story from today. Jane Pike's world had been built on the solid bedrock of her father's competence. John Pike had been the land agent for the old Duke of Cheshire for 30 years. A man whose knowledge of the vast estate was as intimate and complete as a scholar's knowledge of a beloved text. He understood the language of the soil, the grammar of water, and the slow, patient syntax of stone and timber. He had arrived a young man with nothing but a letter of recommendation and a set of surveyor's tools, and he had made himself indispensable through sheer, unwavering diligence. His wife, Mary, had died giving birth to Jane, a sorrow that settled deep into the lines around his eyes, but never soured his nature. He raised his daughter himself, with the help of a series of housekeepers who came and went, none quite understanding the quiet, self-contained world the father and daughter built together. Instead of teaching her needlepoint and watercolor, John Pike taught Jane how to read a map, how to test the pH of soil with litmus paper, and how to tell good mortar from bad by its color and texture. She walked the fields with him from the time she was old enough to keep up, her small hand in his, listening as he explained the principles of crop rotation, the necessity of ditching and draining the low-lying pastures, and the art of managing woodlands for a sustainable yield of timber. He spoke of the land not as a commodity, but as a living entity that required respect and understanding. "You listen to it, Jane," he would say, tapping the earth with the heel of his boot. "It will tell you what it needs." He gave her lessons in bookkeeping at the heavy oak desk in his office, the air thick with the scent of ink and drying paper. She learned to rule ledgers, to calculate yields, and to understand the intricate web of tenancies, rents, and obligations that held the estate together. He treated her not as a girl to be sheltered, but as an apprentice to be trained. His greatest gift to her on her 16th birthday was not a piece of jewelry but a pocket compass, its case of heavy, polished brass, and its needle a sliver of magnetized blue steel that danced with restless precision before settling on true north. It was a navigator's instrument, a tool for finding one's way when all landmarks were lost. It was his way of telling her that he trusted her to find her own direction. When John Pike died suddenly of a lung fever in the damp winter of her 22nd year, the world Jane had known collapsed. The old Duke had passed 2 years prior, and the title had gone to a distant, London-based cousin who viewed the Cheshire estate as little more than a source of revenue and a place for occasional shooting parties. This new Duke had no sentimental attachment to the people who served it. He saw John Pike's death as an administrative inconvenience, and his daughter as a loose end. Jane was an unmarried woman with no family to take her in, a lingering reminder of an older, more personal way of running things that the new Duke and his modern sensibilities found inefficient and untidy. The end of her life at the ducal estate came not with a shout, but with the dry rustle of paper. A week after her father was buried in the small churchyard of St. Giles, a letter arrived, summoning her to the estate office. It was no longer her father's office, filled with the familiar scent of his pipe tobacco and the comfortable clutter of his work. It had been cleared out, painted a sterile cream color, and now housed the Duke's solicitor, a Mr. Finch, a thin, pale man from London with spectacles that seemed to magnify his lack of feeling. He did not rise when she entered. He gestured to a hard-backed chair opposite his desk, a vast expanse of polished mahogany that separated them like a courtroom bench. He spoke in a monotone, his words precise and devoid of any warmth. He offered the Duke's condolences on her father's passing, a perfunctory phrase that sounded as if it had been memorized from a book of etiquette. Then he came to the matter at hand. His Grace the Duke, Mr. Finch began, is mindful of your father's long service. He is also mindful of your delicate position. He slid a sheaf of documents across the desk. As you know, the cottage you occupy is tied to the position of land agent. As that position is now vacant and will be filled by a new appointee with his own family, it is necessary for you to vacate the premises. Jane said nothing. She had known this was coming. She simply watched him, her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm. Her stillness seemed to unnerve him slightly. However, he continued, clearing his throat, His Grace does not wish to see you turned out with nothing. He has instructed me to make a provision, a gesture of his esteem for your late father. He pushed the documents closer to her. This is a deed of gift. His Grace is deeding to you, in perpetuity, the property known as Stoke Manor, along with its remaining 300 acres. He paused, as if expecting a show of gratitude. Stoke, the name was a joke in the district. It was a small Jacobean manor house miles from anywhere, left to rot for decades. The last tenant farmer had abandoned it 11 years ago, defeated by the leaking roof, the flooded fields, and the sheer, overwhelming damp. It was considered worthless, a drain on the estate's books. Giving it to her was an act of public generosity that was, in private reality, a clever way of saddling her with a liability. Furthermore, Mr. Finch added, His Grace has settled upon you a small annuity of £20 per annum, to be paid quarterly. It was just enough money to prevent her from being declared a pauper, but not nearly enough to live on, let alone repair a ruin. It was a dismissal dressed up as charity. Jane picked up the pen. She read the document with the same careful attention her father had taught her to apply to any contract. She noted the clauses, the boundaries of the land clearly marked on the attached map, the finality of the transfer. It was an ejection, but it was also a title, a place of her own. She signed her name, Jane Elizabeth Pike, in a clear, steady hand. She took the heavy iron key that Mr. Finch pushed across the desk. Thank you, she said, her voice even. Please convey my gratitude to His Grace. She stood, gave a slight nod, and walked out of the office, leaving Mr. Finch staring after her, a flicker of disbelief in his cold eyes. He had expected tears or pleas. He had not expected dignity. The journey to Stoke was a pilgrimage of 3 miles, but it felt like a passage to another country. Jane did not hire a cart. The cost was a luxury she could not afford, and more than that, she felt a quiet insistence on making this transition under her own power. She loaded her life into a small, 2-wheeled handcart she had found in her father's shed. It was not a great deal to move. There was a small trunk containing her mother's few dresses and her own, a box of her father's books on agriculture and surveying, a sack of kitchen essentials, flour, salt, tea, and her bedding, wrapped tightly in oilcloth. On top, nestled in a blanket, was the wooden box that held her father's tools. His measuring chain, his plumb bob, his drafting instruments, and the brass-cased compass. She set out at dawn, the Cheshire sky a uniform sheet of pearl gray. The air was cool and smelled of wet leaves and the faint, ever-present trace of coal smoke from distant cottages. The first mile of her journey was through the manicured heart of the ducal estate. The lane was well maintained, the hedgerows neatly trimmed, the great oaks standing like sentinels in the rolling parkland. Here, every view was composed, every tree and stone wall a testament to generations of careful management. It was the world her father had tended, and leaving it felt like a physical ache. But as she passed the west gate and turned onto the public road leading towards Holverton, the landscape began to change. The lane narrowed, and the surface degraded to rutted earth. The hedgerows grew wild and tangled with bramble and old man's beard. This was land that was not so carefully curated, land that belonged to tenant farmers or smaller freeholders. She pulled the cart steadily, the iron-rimmed wheels grinding over stones. Her arms and back began to ache with the unfamiliar strain, but she found a rhythm in the work, a grim satisfaction in the forward motion. She was not fleeing, she was advancing towards something. With her father's trained eye, she observed everything. She saw fields where the drainage was failing, water pooling in the low spots, a sign of clogged culverts or neglected ditches. She saw fences mended with wire and hope, and gates that sagged on their posts. She noted the change in the soil, from the rich loam of the Duke's home farm to a heavier, wetter clay as she drew nearer to Greystoke. She knew, from studying her father's maps, that this land was historically marshy, tamed only by a complex system of medieval drainage channels that required constant maintenance. After 2 hours of walking, she turned off the main lane onto an even smaller track, little more than 2 ruts in the grass. A weathered finger-post sign, its letters almost erased by years of wind and rain, pointed the way. Greystoke Manor. The air here felt different, stiller and heavier. The trees, mostly alder and willow that thrived in damp ground, crowded closer to the path. A profound silence settled, broken only by the cawing of a distant crow and the squeak of the cart's axle. The final approach was up a gentle rise, and as she crested it, she saw the house for the first time. It sat low against the gray sky, a long, dark shape of stone and slate, flanked by skeletal trees. It was not grand, but it had a stubborn, defiant solidity. It looked less like a home and more like a geological feature, something that had grown out of the earth and was slowly being reclaimed by it. Jane stopped, breathing heavily. She set down the handles of the cart, her knuckles white. She was cold, tired, and utterly alone. She drew the compass from her pocket. The blue needle trembled, then settled, pointing north. She had her bearings. She picked up the handles and walked towards the gate. The gates of Greystoke Manor were wrought iron, their delicate scrollwork choked with rust and ivy. One of them had fallen from its upper hinge and leaned drunkenly against the stone pillar, leaving a gap just wide enough for her and the handcart to pass through. The driveway beyond was a ghost, its original gravel surface almost entirely consumed by a mat of weeds, moss, and determined saplings. As Jane made her way towards the house, her boots sinking into the soft, damp earth, the scale of the neglect became starkly apparent. The house was built of a local gray sandstone that had weathered to a patchwork of dark, almost black stains where the damp had settled in, and lighter patches of silver-green lichen. It was a long, 2-story structure in the Jacobean style, with stone-mullioned windows and tall, ornate chimney stacks. Many of the leaded glass panes in the windows were broken, the empty spaces stuffed with yellowed newspapers or rags, giving the facade the look of a blind and battered face. Yet, beneath the decay, the house had what her father would have called good bones. The stonework was true, The roofline, though sagging in one spot, was largely straight, and the foundations seemed solid. Jane walked the perimeter of the house first, her practiced eye assessing the structure. She noted the downspouts clogged with a solid mass of leaves and debris, forcing rainwater to cascade down the walls. She saw where pointing had failed between the stones, creating pathways for moisture to penetrate deep into the structure. The slate roof, a beautiful, heavy Welsh slate, was missing dozens of tiles, leaving the underlying timbers exposed to the elements. It was a litany of failures, each one compounding the next. Using the large iron key, she opened the front door. It groaned open on protesting hinges, releasing a wave of cold, musty air that smelled of decay, wet plaster, and the faint, animal scent of mice. The entrance hall was cavernous and dark. A film of gray dust and grime covered every surface. A grand staircase of dark oak rose into the gloom, its banister thick with cobwebs. Water had dripped from the ceiling above, staining the plaster a sickly brown and causing a section of it to collapse, leaving a pile of debris on the flagstone floor. She moved from room to room on the ground floor, her footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The drawing room, with its tall windows overlooking what had once been a garden, was a ruin of peeling wallpaper and rotten floorboards near the windows. The dining room was little better. But in the back of the house, she found the library. It was a long, narrow room, lined from floor to ceiling with empty oak shelves. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, and here the damage was less severe. The roof above this section seemed more intact. The floorboards were dusty but solid underfoot. One of the large windows was boarded up, but the other, though grimy, was whole. It was here she decided to make her camp. She unrolled her bedding in a corner, built a small, cautious fire in the vast hearth with twigs she gathered from outside, and set a kettle on to boil. As the light faded, she sat on her bedroll, sipping hot tea from a tin mug, the firelight pushing back the shadows. The house groaned and settled around her, the wind whistling through the broken panes. It was a place of profound loss and abandonment. But as she looked at the solid oak shelves and the well-proportioned lines of the room, she felt not despair, but a flicker of possibility. Her father had always said the library was the heart of a well-run estate, the place where knowledge was stored and plans were made. This room felt different from the others, more preserved, as if it had been waiting. For the first week, Jane's life fell into a simple, brutal rhythm of survival. She spent her days making the library habitable, and her nights huddled by the fire, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the old house. The annuity provided just enough for basic supplies, which she bought on a weekly walk into Holverton. Oats, flour, candles, and lamp oil. She worked with a focused intensity, fueled by a deep-seated need to impose order on the chaos. She swept away years of dust and debris, scrubbed the floorboards with a stiff brush and lye soap until the clean scent of oak began to overcome the smell of mildew, and meticulously cleaned the one intact window, letting precious daylight flood into the room. It was during the cleaning of the library shelves that she first noticed the anomaly. The shelving was all of a piece, dark, heavy oak, expertly joined, covering 3 of the 4 walls. But on the wall to the left of the fireplace, one section, about 6 feet wide, felt different. The wood was a fraction lighter in color, the style of the carving on the vertical supports subtly simpler than the rest. When she ran her hand over it, it felt smoother, less worn. Her father had taught her to be observant, to notice the small detail that was out of place. She tapped the wooden backboard behind the shelves. In most places, It produced a dull, solid thud. But behind this one section, the sound was different, a hollow, resonant echo. Her curiosity piqued. She fetched a crowbar from the dilapidated tool shed she had discovered behind the house. Carefully, so as not to damage the wood more than necessary, she began to pry the shelving unit away from the wall. It came away with a groan of old nails, revealing not the expected lath and plaster, but a solid panel of oak set flush with the wall. And behind that, when she worked the crowbar into a seam and levered it open, she found the bricks. A section of the wall, the size of a doorway, had been bricked up. The mortar was old but professionally done, clearly intended to be a permanent seal. A thrill, a mixture of fear and excitement, ran through her. This was no accident. This was deliberate. For 2 days, she worked with a hammer and a cold chisel she'd found, patiently chipping away at the mortar, her arms aching, her hands raw. The bricks came loose one by one, filling the room with the chalky smell of dust. Finally, she had made an opening large enough to squeeze through. Holding a lit candle, she crawled into the darkness beyond. She found herself in a small, stone-lined room, no bigger than a closet. It was utterly dry and still, the air cold but clean. In the center of the room stood a small, plain writing desk and a single chair. On the desk was a leather-bound ledger and a black tin deed box, its surface filmed with a fine layer of dust. The key was in the lock. With a trembling hand, she turned it. The box opened onto a sight that made her gasp. It was filled with small canvas bags, tied at the neck with string. She opened one. Inside, glinting in the candlelight, were gold sovereigns. She counted them out, her heart pounding. There were 50 in that bag alone. She opened another and another. In all, there were 10 bags, 500 gold sovereigns. Beneath them lay a small silver locket on a delicate chain and a folded letter, its paper yellowed with age, sealed with wax. She broke the seal and read the elegant, spidery script. To whomever finds this place, my name is Eleanor Vance. I have been the mistress of Stoke Manor for 40 years, since my husband, Captain Thomas Vance, fell at Waterloo in 1815. I have no children, and my husband's family are vultures who would see me penniless. For 20 years, I have managed this estate alone and saved what I could, hiding it from their greedy eyes. This room was my husband's study. I have sealed it to protect what is rightfully mine, and now, rightfully yours. There are 500 sovereigns here, and the estate ledger from my time. Use it to care for this house. It has been a good and faithful shelter to me. I pray it will be the same for you. May you find peace here. Jane sat back on her heels in the dusty darkness, the letter in her hand. She was not alone. Another woman, a century before her, had faced dispossession and had fought back with patience, intelligence, and foresight. Eleanor Vance had left not just money, but a legacy, a plan, a flicker of hope, sealed in stone, waiting for someone with the wit to find it. The 500 sovereigns felt like a sacred trust, not a windfall. Jane knew that the sum, while substantial, could be squandered quickly on foolish things. Eleanor Vance's letter had given her a purpose, to care for the house, and her father had given her the knowledge to do so wisely. She did not rush into Holverton and announce her fortune. She continued her modest life, but now she had a war chest. Her first priority was the roof. A house, her father always said, is only as good as the roof that keeps it dry. She walked into town and sought out Mr. Thomas Gable, a stonemason and slighter, who had recently retired but was known throughout the county for his skill. He was a man in his late 60s, with hands like gnarled oak roots and eyes that had seen a lifetime of weather. He listened to her in his small cottage, his expression skeptical as she, a young woman alone, described the work needed at the derelict manor. "It's a fool's errand, miss," he said bluntly. "That place is ready to fall down." Jane did not argue. She simply unrolled a drawing she had made on a piece of foolscap paper. It was a diagram of the roof's structure, with the damaged sections clearly marked, notes on the pitch, and calculations for the number of new slates required. Mr. Gable looked at the drawing, then at her, his skepticism slowly turning to respect. "You know your business," he conceded. She offered him a fair wage, paid weekly in advance. He agreed to start the following Monday, bringing his son, Arthur, a carpenter whose skills would be needed to replace the rotted support timbers. The arrival of the Gables marked a turning point. The silence of Greystoke was broken by the rhythmic tap of hammers and the scrape of trowels. Thomas Gable was a patient teacher, showing Jane how to mix lime mortar to the perfect consistency and how to lay the heavy Welsh slates in overlapping courses, securing each one with a copper nail. She worked alongside them, not as a mistress directing servants, but as a fellow laborer, her hands becoming calloused, her face smudged with grime. Arthur Gable, a quiet man in his 30s, methodically began to repair the window frames, carefully cutting out the rotten wood and splicing in new sections of seasoned oak. News of the work at Greystoke spread through Hulverton. Mrs. Davies, the baker's wife, a woman with a kind heart and an insatiable curiosity, began to make a weekly trip out with a fresh loaf of bread and the local gossip. She saw Jane not as the Duke's pitiful charity case, but as a young woman of industry and purpose. Through Mrs. Davies, Jane found others. She was introduced to Mr. Hemlock, a nurseryman whose family had worked the gardens of Cheshire for 200 years. He came to inspect the overgrown walled garden, a 1-acre jungle of brambles and weeds. With the discerning eye of a historian, he identified the gnarled, neglected shapes of old fruit trees, pear, apple, and plum, their stock varieties long out of fashion, but prized for their hardiness. "These are treasures, Miss Pike," he said, his voice filled with reverence. "With a proper pruning, they'll bear fruit again." He agreed to help her clear the garden and restore the beds, taking his payment in cuttings from the old trees. Slowly, a community began to form around the shared work of restoration. It was a community built not on words of friendship, but on the solid foundation of mutual respect for craft, for a job well done. Each repaired slate, each new window pane, each cleared garden bed was a small victory against the decay, a testament to the life that was returning to Greystoke Manor. As the seasons turned, Greystoke Manor began to breathe again. The roof was now a solid, unbroken expanse of grey slate, shedding the Cheshire rain with quiet efficiency. The windows, reglazed and repainted, looked out onto the world with clear eyes. Inside, the damp was slowly receding, the scent of mildew replaced by the clean aroma of lime plaster and beeswax. Jane had become a familiar sight in Hulverton, no longer the strange girl living in the ruin, but Miss Pike of Greystoke. Shopkeepers greeted her by name. Farmers tipped their hats as she passed on the lane. Her quiet determination and her obvious competence had earned her a measure of respect that the Duke's title could never have bestowed. She lived simply, her days governed by the tasks at hand. The annuity covered her personal needs, while Eleanor Vance's sovereigns were carefully allocated to the house's restoration, each expense recorded in a new ledger. But her greatest tool was the one Eleanor had left alongside the gold, the old estate ledger. It was a masterpiece of meticulous record-keeping. Eleanor had mapped every field, noted the soil composition, and recorded crop yields for 2 decades. Most importantly, she had detailed a comprehensive system of land drains that her husband had installed, channels and culverts that had long since become blocked and forgotten. One section of the Greystoke lands, a 50-acre parcel known as the Water Meadows, had been written off by the Duke's estate as useless bog. For years, it had been a sodden marsh, good for little more than snipe shooting. But Eleanor's maps showed it as the most fertile pasture on the estate, kept dry by a network of stone-lined culverts that diverted water from a nearby spring. Armed with this knowledge, Jane hired a crew of local laborers. For a month they dug, clearing decades of silt and roots from the old channels. The day they cleared the final blockage, there was a great gurgle as the backed-up water found its old course, and within a week, the surface of the meadow began to dry. By the following spring, it was covered in a lush growth of clover and ryegrass. She leased the newly reclaimed pasture to a local dairy farmer, Mr. Prescott, for a handsome sum. The contract, which she drew up herself based on templates from her father's books, provided her with her first independent, recurring income. The Duke's new land agent, a brisk, dismissive man who had replaced Mr. Finch's firm, was astonished and humiliated. He had assessed the land as worthless. Jane Pike, with her inherited knowledge and quiet work, had proven him wrong. Small rituals began to anchor her new life. Every Friday afternoon, Thomas and Arthur Gable would join her in the now habitable kitchen for tea and scones, spreading out plans on the scrubbed pine table to discuss the next phase of work. Mrs. Davies's weekly delivery of bread became a cherished social event. And in the evenings, Jane would sit in the library, the fire crackling, and study Eleanor's ledger, feeling a profound connection to the woman who had walked these same floors a century before her. The house was no longer a burden or a ruin. It was a home, a livelihood, and a testament. One crisp October evening, with the scent of wood smoke hanging in the air, Jane sat in the restored library. A fire of well-seasoned oak, harvested from a fallen tree on her own land, burned brightly in the hearth, its flames reflecting in the polished floorboards. The room was complete. The shelves were filled with her father's books, and a few she had purchased herself in Holverton. The walls were a warm, creamy lime wash, and thick wool curtains, which she had sewn herself, were drawn against the night. The space was no longer a cold, dusty shell. It was warm, alive, and filled with a deep, resonant peace. She stood and walked to the mantelpiece, a heavy beam of oak that Arthur Gable had salvaged from a collapsed barn. On one end of the mantel, she placed her father's brass compass. Its polished surface gleamed in the firelight, the needle securely at rest. It was the tool that had taught her to find her way, a symbol of her father's practical love and his faith in her ability to navigate the world. From a small wooden box on the desk, she took Eleanor Vance's silver locket. It was simple, unadorned, and cool to the touch. She had never opened it, feeling that its contents were a private memory belonging to its original owner. She placed the locket on the other end of the mantelpiece. The two objects, one of brass, one of silver, sat in quiet companionship. They represented the two people who had secured her future. Her father, John Pike, whom she had loved and lost, and Eleanor Vance, a stranger she would never know, but to whom she owed an unpayable debt. They were her true inheritance. She thought of the Duke in his London townhouse, who had likely never given Greystoke or its inconvenient inhabitant a second thought after signing the deed. He had meant to cast her off, to consign her to a life of genteel poverty in a crumbling prison of stone. He had given her what he believed to be worthless, a final dismissive gesture to close an old account. He could never have imagined that in his carelessness, he had given her everything: a home, a purpose, a community, and a connection to a past that nourished her present. He had intended to give her an ending, but he had given her a beginning. Jane Pike was 22 and had been given a ruin to be rid of her. The Duke thought he was giving her a grave, a place where her prospects would go to die. He was wrong. He had given her the keys to her own life. She had found value where others saw only decay, and strength where they had expected weakness. The story of Greystoke is a reminder that the things we inherit, be they land, objects, or the quiet lessons of a loved one, hold a power that is not always visible on the surface. We hope her story has brought you a measure of peace today. If you enjoyed it, please consider sharing it with someone who might find it meaningful. And we leave you with this thought: what overlooked or forgotten thing in your own life might hold the key to a new beginning?